I, David Alpha of the Silver Pines, formally reject you, Luna, as my fated mate." The declaration echoed through the assembly hall, plunging the room into a suffocating standstill. Luna stood on the dais, her hands trembling. David's posture was rigid, his gaze devoid of the warmth she had known since childhood. "My people require a hardened leader, not a fragile shadow," he added, his tone a polite but devastating blade. Before Luna could process the humiliation, slow, mocking applause severed the silence. From the arched doorway stepped Silas, Alpha of the rival Blood Moon pack. "If you so carelessly discard such a treasure, David," Silas murmured, his eyes locking onto Luna's tear-filled gaze, "I will gladly claim her as my own." The Grand Hall of Silver Pines was an architectural marvel of polished cedar and river stone, designed to project unyielding strength. Tonight, it felt like an execution chamber. The collective breath of the pack hitched as Silas advanced. His heavy, dark boots made no sound against the marble floor, a predator's grace that immediately set the room's elite guard on edge. Silas was the antithesis to David's golden-haired, rigid perfection. He was raven dark, his features carved from harsh winters and violent battles. The blood feud between their packs spanned 3 generations, a history paved with ash and grief. David shifted, his broad shoulders squaring as he stepped in front of the elders' table. "You trespass, Silas," David warned, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that demanded submission. "You were invited under a banner of peace to witness the succession ceremony, not to interfere in pack law." "Interfere?" Silas stopped at the base of the dais, his hands casually resting in the pockets of his tailored obsidian coat. A dangerous, polite smile played on his lips. "I am merely observing the laws of nature, Alpha David. You abandoned a mate. An unprecedented, foolish choice, but yours entirely. By your own words, she is now unbound." Luna remained frozen on the raised platform. The agonizing sting of David's rejection still burned in her chest, a hollow, tearing sensation where her spiritual bond to him was violently fraying. She had loved David since they were children, skinning their knees in the pine forests. They had learned to track together. They had studied the ancient texts together. But as the mantle of Alpha had settled upon his shoulders last winter, David had changed. He became obsessed with alliances, military might, and optics. She, a healer with an affinity for botany rather than bloodshed, had become a liability in his calculating eyes. She slowly turned her head toward David. She waited for him to retract his words, to realize the magnitude of the mistake he was making. But David only watched Silas, his jaw clenched, his golden eyes narrowed in calculating defiance. David did not look at her. That realization was a physical blow, sharper than the rejection itself. He had planned this. He had invited their greatest enemy here to show absolute dominance, to prove he was unswayed by fate or sentiment. "She is unbound, but she is still Silver Pines," David stated, his tone impeccably diplomatic despite the rising hostility in the room. "Her future will be decided by the council." "I disagree," Silas countered smoothly. He took a deliberate step up the dais. The Silver Pines guards drew their ceremonial blades, the metallic rings slicing through the tension. Silas did not even flinch. He kept his dark, intense gaze locked solely on Luna. "Do not take another step," David commanded. The air crackled with his oppressive aura, a heavy, invisible weight designed to force lesser wolves to their knees. Silas ignored the pressure. He ascended the second step, stopping mere inches from Luna. Up close, the Blood Moon Alpha smelled of impending rain and sharp cedar. Luna looked up into his eyes. She expected to see mockery, a cruel victor claiming a spoil of war to humiliate his rival. Instead, she found a strange, simmering intensity, a tempest of respect and ancient recognition that made her breath catch in her throat. A fragile shadow, he called you. Silas spoke softly, his voice meant only for her, yet carrying in the breathless silence of the hall. He looks at the moon and complains that it does not burn like the sun. How profoundly blind. Luna swallowed hard, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Because you are not a shadow," Silas replied, raising his hand. He did not touch her, his fingers hovering respectfully a millimeter from her cheek. "And I do not let priceless things shatter on the floor." David's composure finally fractured. "Get away from her, Silas. This is a diplomatic warning. Touch her, and the truce ends tonight." Silas slowly turned his head to look over his shoulder at David. The smile was gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute authority. "The truce remains intact, David. I am simply claiming what you discarded." Before David could lunge, before the guards could close the distance, Silas turned back to Luna. He offered his hand, palm up, a silent question. A choice. Luna looked at Silas's scarred palm, then passed him to David. David's eyes were wide, flashing with sudden, possessive panic as he read her hesitation. For the first time all evening, David looked at her not as a liability, but as a loss. Luna placed her small, trembling hand into Silas's larger, calloused one. A collective gasp tore through the room as Silas pulled her gently against his chest. He moved with blinding speed, dipping his head. His teeth grazed the sensitive, pulsing juncture of her neck and shoulder. He did not bite to harm. He bit to claim. The magical surge of a high alpha's mark flooded the air, a brilliant flash of azure energy that violently slammed into David's chest, throwing the Silver Pines alpha back a step. Silas was marking her. Publicly, irrevocably, right in front of the man who had just thrown her away. The scent of the claim hit the room like a physical shockwave. It was an intoxicating blend of petrichor and night-blooming jasmine, completely overpowering the sterile, cedar-heavy air of the Silver Pines hall. David stumbled backward, as if he had been struck by a kinetic force. His chest heaved, his lungs fighting for oxygen, as the bond he had just severed with Luna was violently, instantly replaced by another. He watched in absolute paralyzed horror. Silas's dark coat enveloped Luna's slender frame, shielding her from the chaotic uproar erupting around them. The bite was not a mere physical wound. It was an ancient, spiritual tethering. David could see the azure light radiating from the point of contact, a testament to the raw power of the Blood Moon Alpha. "Stop!" David roared, the polite veneer of diplomacy shattering completely. He lunged forward, his eyes flashing a dangerous, predatory gold. His claws elongated, ripping through the expensive fabric of his formal gloves. I said stop, but an invisible barrier of energy, the protective aura of a claiming alpha, repelled him. David crashed into the unseen wall, the impact rattling his bones. The elders of his pack were shouting, guards were rushing the dais, but it was all moving in agonizing slow motion. David's gaze was locked on Luna's face. She was not screaming. She was not fighting. Her eyes were closed, a tear slipping down her pale cheek, but her expression was one of profound, peaceful surrender. Silas slowly lifted his head. His lips were stained with a single drop of crimson, and his dark eyes burned with a triumphant, territorial fire. He maintained his protective hold around Luna's waist, effortlessly supporting her as she adjusted to the overwhelming rush of the new bond. "You have gone mad," David breathed, pushing himself up from the polished floor, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of rage and a sudden, terrifying emptiness. You cannot mark a Silver Pines female without the Council's consent. This is an act of war, Silas. She is no longer Silver Pines, Silas declared, his voice easily carrying over the din of the panicked crowd. The guards had surrounded the dais, their weapons drawn, but none dared to strike an alpha engaged in a sacred rite. You severed her ties to this land and your bloodline when you rejected her before the ancestors. She is Blood Moon now, my Luna in name and title. The word hung in the air, heavy and irrefutable. His Luna. David felt a sickening twist in his gut. He had spent months calculating this move. He needed an alliance with the formidable ironclad pack, and their alpha had offered his warrior daughter as a mate on the condition that David's fated bond was broken. David had convinced himself it was for the greater good. Luna was too soft, too gentle to survive the coming conflicts. He told himself he was sparing her the burden of leadership. But watching Silas, his greatest rival, a man known for his ruthless battlefield tactics, hold her with such tender, possessive reverence, a suffocating wave of possessiveness clawed at David's throat. She does not belong to you, David growled, stepping closer, though he remained wary of the magical barrier. She is in shock. You took advantage of a vulnerable moment. Luna slowly opened her eyes. The residual gold of her Silver Pines heritage was already beginning to swirl with the deep, twilight indigo of the blood moon. She turned her gaze to David, and the sheer emptiness in her expression struck him harder than any physical blow. There was no anger, no sorrow, only the cold, distant look of a stranger. I chose this. Luna spoke, her voice surprisingly steady. The hall fell deathly silent, straining to hear her. You made your choice for the good of your pack, David. I have made mine for the good of my soul. I will not stay where I am considered a burden. David opened his mouth, but no words came. The polite, calculated alpha, renowned for his silver tongue and strategic mind, was rendered entirely mute. He watched as Silas gently adjusted his coat over Luna's shoulders, a deeply intimate gesture that made David's blood boil. We are leaving, Silas announced, his gaze sweeping over the armed guards with profound disinterest. If anyone wishes to challenge my claim, you may try. But know that the treaty dictates safe passage for visiting alphas and their mates. The elders frantically exchanged panicked glances. To attack Silas now would break a century-old treaty and invite a war they were not fully prepared to wage. Elder Thorn, the oldest of the council, raised a trembling hand, signaling the guards to stand down. Let them pass, Thorn commanded, his voice thick with disapproval and sorrow. He looked at David with a deeply critical eye. The alpha has made his bed. Silas turned, keeping Luna tucked securely against his side, and began to descend the dais. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, fearful path toward the grand oak doors. David stood frozen on the platform, his hands balled into fists so tight his palms bled. He watched the back of Luna's dress disappear into the sea of shadows and murmurs, the horrific realization settling heavily into his bones. He had just handed his greatest weakness directly to his greatest enemy. The journey to the Blood Moon territory was conducted in absolute silence. The sleek, armored SUV tore through the winding mountain roads, leaving the polished elegance of Silver Pines far behind. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Luna sat rigidly against the leather seat, staring out the tinted window at the blurring pine trees. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache where Silas had marked her. A constant reminder of the irrevocable turning point her life had just taken. Silas sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. The terrifying, dominant aura he had projected in the assembly hall was entirely dialed back, replaced by a quiet, observant stillness. He was watching her reflection in the glass. "Are you in pain?" Silas finally broke the silence, his voice a low, polite baritone that startled her slightly. "No," Luna replied, keeping her eyes on the passing forest. "Just numb. It feels as though I have stepped into someone else's life. The initial shock of a severing is severe," Silas said softly. He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before gently resting his hand over hers. His warmth was startling, a stark contrast to the coldness that had settled in her chest. "David was a fool to do it so publicly. He intended to break your spirit so you would quietly accept a lesser station." Luna finally turned to look at him. In the dim lighting of the car, Silas's sharp, imposing features were softened by the shadows. "Why did you step in? We are enemies. Our packs have spilled each other's blood for decades. Taking me, it is an immense political risk." "I do not care about the politics of Silver Pines," Silas stated calmly, his dark eyes unwavering. "And we are not enemies, Luna. Our grandfathers were enemies. Our fathers were enemies. I have spent my tenure as Alpha trying to rebuild what they burned. But more importantly, I stepped in because I have watched you for years." Luna's brow furrowed in confusion. "Watched me?" "At the border summits, the solstice festivals," Silas explained, a faint, almost shy smile touching the corner of his mouth. "You were always in David's shadow, mending the injured, calming the panicked, negotiating trade while he postured and threatened. You are the heart of that territory. I knew the moment David inherited the Alpha title, his ambition would blind him to your worth. I simply waited." The admission took her breath away. While David had viewed her gentle nature as a liability, this fearsome, battle-scarred Alpha had recognized it as a strength. A small, unfamiliar spark of warmth ignited in the cold void David had left behind. Miles away, in the desolate grand hall of Silver Pines, David sat alone on the edge of the dais. The guests had fled. The elders had retired, leaving behind a thick cloud of whispered judgments. The silence of the room was deafening, pressing against David's eardrums until they rang. He stared at the spot where Luna had stood. He remembered her clearly from when they were children. He recalled a particularly harsh winter when a younger, softer David had fallen through the ice of the frozen lake. It was Luna who had found him. Luna who had dragged his freezing body to the shore, using her innate healing magic to keep his heart beating until help arrived. She had burned her own hands with the sheer force of the energy she transferred to him. "She is weak," he had told the assembly tonight. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He had believed, with utter certainty, that breaking the bond would make him invincible. The ironclad alliance required a ruthless mate, a warrior who could fight by his side. Luna could not fight. Therefore, she had to be set aside. It was simple logic, cold, calculating, and necessary for the survival of his people. But logic had not prepared him for the visceral, agonizing tearing in his soul. It had not prepared him for the sight of Silas's teeth grazing her skin. When Silas marked her, a phantom pain had seared through David's own neck, a brutal reminder of the cosmic law he had just violated. Fated mates were designed by the moon itself. Rejecting one was a violation of nature, Watching another Alpha claim her was a psychological torture David had not anticipated. He looked down at his trembling hands. The scent of her, jasmine and vanilla, was fading from the room, rapidly replaced by the lingering, phantom scent of Silas's petrichor. "Alpha?" A voice called out softly from the doorway. David snapped his head up. His beta, Marcus, stood tentatively near the entrance, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "The ironclad delegation has sent word," Marcus reported, keeping his eyes carefully averted from David's devastated posture. "Alpha Vance is pleased with your display of resolve. He arrives tomorrow with his daughter to formalize your new union." David felt a wave of absolute nausea wash over him. He had won. He had secured the strongest military alliance in the region. He had proven his ruthlessness. "Good." David forced the word out, his voice sounding hollow and metallic. "Prepare the guest quarters." Marcus nodded slowly. "And about Luna, sir?" "The pack is unsettled. They view the blood moon mark as a terrible omen." David's golden eyes flashed, a terrifying, unstable energy rippling from his frame. "Luna is dead to us," he commanded, though his voice cracked on the final syllable. "Anyone who speaks her name will answer to me." As Marcus quickly bowed and retreated, David buried his face in his hands. He had built his impenetrable fortress, but as the first night without his fated mate descended, he realized he had locked himself inside a tomb. The morning sun offered no warmth to the Silver Pines estate, its pale light struggling to pierce the heavy, gray cloud cover that had settled over the mountains. Inside the Alpha's sprawling quarters, David stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, methodically fastening the silver cuffs of his tailored charcoal suit. He moved with mechanical precision, his face an unreadable mask. But beneath the surface, his body was waging a quiet, desperate war against itself. The severing of a fated bond was not merely an emotional trauma. It was a physical amputation of the soul. A dull, rhythmic ache throbbed at the base of his skull, and a persistent, freezing hollow had hollowed out his chest, a void that no amount of ambient heat could warm. He stared at his reflection, noting the faint, dark circles beneath his golden eyes. He had not slept. Every time he had closed his eyes, his mind had replayed the blinding azure flash of Silas's teeth grazing Luna's neck, the agonizing phantom sting of a claim that belonged to an enemy. He forced his jaw to unclench. This was the price of power, he reminded himself coldly. He had excised a weakness to secure a fortress. Today, that fortress was arriving. The heavy metallic rumble of armored engines echoed through the valley, vibrating against the reinforced glass of his window. David turned, watching as a convoy of matte black, military-grade SUVs rolled through the wrought iron gates of the estate. The ironclad pack had arrived. There was no elegance in their approach, no diplomatic subtlety, only a sheer, crushing display of mechanized dominance. By the time David descended the grand staircase to the main courtyard, his beta, Marcus, had already assembled the honor guard. The air was thick with the scent of diesel, cold steel, and the sharp, aggressive pheromones of the ironclad wolves. The door of the lead vehicle swung open, and Alpha Vance stepped out. Vance was a mountain of a man, his face crisscrossed with pale, jagged scars, his broad shoulders stretching the fabric of his heavy military coat. "Alpha David," Vance boomed, his voice like grinding stones, bypassing any polite greeting. He did not offer his hand. Instead, he gave a curt, assessing nod. "A fine estate, a bit exposed on the southern ridge, but we can fortify that. I see you managed to clean house before our arrival." The callous reference to Luna's departure sent an involuntary, violent spike of defensive rage through David's bloodstream. He forced a diplomatic, rigid smile. "Alpha Vance, welcome to Silver Pines. The southern ridge is protected by a natural ravine, but I welcome your strategic input. The treaty stands, as agreed." "Indeed it does," Vance replied, stepping aside. "Allow me to present the seal of our alliance. My daughter, Elena." From the shadows of the vehicle emerged a woman who looked as though she had been forged from the same unforgiving steel as her father. Elena was strikingly beautiful, but it was a severe, predatory beauty. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, emphasizing sharp, aristocratic cheekbones and eyes the color of a winter sky. She wore a tailored, dark gray combat suit that was entirely practical, yet undeniably imposing. She surveyed the courtyard, her gaze lingering on the delicate, silver-leafed willow tree at the center. A tree Luna had painstakingly cultivated from a near-dead sapling years ago. A rather fragile centerpiece for a stronghold, Elena observed, her voice smooth, polite, and dripping with thinly veiled disdain. She stepped closer to David, the scent of ozone and crushed stone radiating from her. "I trust the rest of your defenses are not so easily uprooted, Alpha David." David looked at the willow. Its silver leaves shivered in the cold wind, a lingering ghost of Luna's gentle touch. For a fraction of a second, an intense, suffocating wave of grief tightened his throat. "It has survived harsher winters than you might expect, Lady Elena," David replied evenly, offering his arm. "Shall we proceed to the council room? We have defensive perimeters to discuss." Elena took his arm. Her grip was strong, possessive, and entirely devoid of warmth. As they walked through the grand hall, passing the exact spot on the dais where he had shattered Luna's heart just 12 hours prior, David felt the phantom ache in his chest flare into a burning agony. The pack elders bowed respectfully as they passed, but David could read the silent, fearful apprehension in their eyes. They had traded their gentle healer for a warlord's daughter. "My father intends to station 200 of our elite guard along your western border," Elena murmured, leaning close to him, her tone strictly business. "We will need to clear the botanical gardens there to make room for the barracks. You have no objections, I assume?" David's footsteps faltered for a fraction of a millisecond. The western gardens were Luna's sanctuary, the source of the medicinal herbs that had kept the Silver Pines pack healthy for a decade. He looked at Elena's cold, expectant face. She was the ally he had bled his soul to acquire. She was the hardened leader his people supposedly needed. "None," David lied, his voice sounding hollow and alien to his own ears. "Clear the gardens. We must prioritize our strength." As they walked toward the war room, David felt the absolute crushing weight of his choices settling over his shoulders. He had built his impenetrable armor, but as Elena's icy grip tightened on his arm, he realized he could no longer feel his own heartbeat. Miles away, bathed in the soft, golden light of the mid-morning sun, Luna awoke in a bed that felt like floating on a cloud of spun silk. For a long, disorienting moment, she stared at the vaulted, dark mahogany ceiling, her mind struggling to reconcile the deep, peaceful slumber she had just experienced with the catastrophic events of the previous night. She gingerly touched the side of her neck. The skin was smooth, unblemished by any wound, yet a faint, pulsing warmth radiated from the spot where Silas had marked her. It was not a painful sensation. Rather, it felt like a quiet, steady heartbeat resting against her pulse, a reassuring tether in a world that had violently flipped upside down. She sat up, taking in her surroundings. The guest suite in the Blood Moon estate was a masterpiece of architectural contrast. While silver pines favored stark whites and polished cedar, this room was a study in rich, grounding tones, deep indigos, obsidian accents, and massive windows that invited the surrounding, untamed forest inside. It did not feel like the fortress of a savage enemy. It felt like a sanctuary. Rising from the bed, Luna found a wardrobe stocked with elegant, comfortable clothing in her exact measurements. She dressed in a soft, dark slate tunic and tailored trousers, the fabric feeling luxurious against her skin. Hesitantly, she opened the heavy oak door of her suite. She expected to find guards stationed outside, wardens to keep the rival alpha's discarded mate in check. Instead, the wide, sunlit corridor was empty, save for a gentle breeze carrying the scent of rich soil and distant rain. She wandered through the sprawling estate, her anxiety slowly ebbing away. Whenever she encountered members of the Blood Moon pack, tall, imposing figures with battle scars and fierce eyes, they did not glare or whisper. Instead, they stopped, lowered their gazes respectfully, and bared their throats in a traditional, deeply reverent gesture of submission. They were treating her not as a spoil of war, but as their Luna. The realization sent a shiver of profound awe down her spine. Following the scent of damp earth and blooming flora, Luna found herself standing before massive, wrought-iron double doors. Pushing them open, she gasped. She had stepped into a colossal, glass-domed conservatory. It was a chaotic, beautiful jungle of rare medicinal herbs, towering ferns, and vibrant, night-blooming flowers. But it was overgrown, wild, and in desperate need of a healer's disciplined hand. "My mother built this place." A low, resonant voice spoke from the shadows. Luna turned, her breath catching. Silas stood at the edge of the foliage, dressed simply in a dark Henley and trousers, holding a steaming porcelain teacup. Without the heavy, formal coat of the previous night, he looked less like a terrifying warlord and more like a weary, watchful guardian. The sunlight caught the faint, silver scars along his jawline, highlighting the harsh life he had endured to secure his pack's survival. "It is breathtaking," Luna whispered, stepping carefully toward a patch of wilted moon lilies, her fingers instinctively brushing against the dry leaves. "But it has been neglected. The soil pH is entirely unbalanced here." Silas walked forward, his movements possessing that same silent, predatory grace, yet completely devoid of threat. He handed her the teacup. "Chamomile and dried blackberry," he murmured, to help with the residual adrenaline. Luna accepted the cup, the warmth seeping into her cold palms. She looked up into his deep, obsidian eyes. "You brought me to your stronghold, Silas. Your people bow to me. You offer me tea. I do not understand. David said your pack only valued raw power and conquest. David understands how to read a ledger, but he does not know how to read a soul." Silas replied smoothly, his gaze dropping momentarily to the faint azure glow beneath her skin, before meeting her eyes again. "My pack has spent 3 generations fighting. We are scarred, Luna. We have warriors in abundance. What we lack, what we have desperately prayed for, is someone who knows how to mend what is broken. We do not need another sword. We need a healer." The quiet, raw vulnerability in his confession struck Luna harder than any shout or command could have. For years, she had been made to feel small, her affinity for healing viewed as a tragic deficiency in a world of wolves. Now, the most feared alpha in the region was standing before her, humbly asking for her strength. "I can save these lilies," Luna said softly, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. She looked around the vast, chaotic greenhouse, I can balance the soil, but it will take time. Silas reached out. He did not grab her, but gently, respectfully, brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The brief contact sent a jolt of comforting electricity straight to her core. "Take all the time you need, Luna," Silas promised, his voice a low, protective vow. "This is your domain now. Here, you will never be asked to hide in the shadows." For the first time since she was a little girl skinning her knees in the forest, Luna smiled. It was a small, fragile thing. But as she looked at the towering, battle-hardened man standing amidst the overgrown flowers, she realized with sudden, shocking clarity that her life had not ended on the dais at Silver Pines. It was only just beginning. The neutral grounds were a stark, circular pavilion built of pale stone, situated exactly on the border where the Silver Pines, Blood Moon, and Ironclad territories converged. By ancient law, all major shifts in pack leadership and alliances had to be formally registered here, under the watchful, impartial eyes of the regional elders. The pavilion was entirely open to the elements, the howling mountain wind serving as a constant reminder of the harsh world they governed. David stood at the edge of the stone platform, his posture rigidly perfect. The phantom ache in his chest had crystallized into a permanent, freezing weight. Elena stood beside him, her hand gripping his forearm with a possessive, territorial tightness that felt more like a shackle than an embrace. She was dressed in severe, imposing combat leathers, her posture daring anyone to challenge their newly forged dominance. Behind them, Alpha Vance and a formidable contingent of Ironclad and Silver Pines guards formed a wall of intimidating silence. "They are late," Elena noted, her voice carrying a sharp edge of irritation. A calculated insult, no doubt. The Blood Moon savage likely does not own a timepiece. "Silas respects the old laws," David replied automatically, his gaze fixed on the dense tree line across the clearing. "He will come." As if summoned by his name, the shadows of the forest seemed to part. A profound, suffocating silence fell over the pavilion as the Blood Moon delegation emerged. There were no armored vehicles, no grandiose displays of military might. Silas walked at the front, dressed in a tailored, midnight blue suit that exuded an aura of terrifying, quiet authority. His mere presence seemed to drop the temperature in the clearing. But David's breath completely halted in his lungs when he saw who walked flawlessly by Silas's side: Luna. She was unrecognizable from the trembling, heartbroken woman he had discarded 2 days prior. She wore a stunning, floor-length gown of deep, twilight indigo, the fabric moving like liquid shadow around her. Her hair was swept up in an elegant, commanding style, interwoven with small, silver moon lilies. But it was not the clothing that stunned David. It was her posture. The perpetual, apologetic slump of her shoulders was gone. She walked with her head held high, radiating a quiet, magnificent strength that commanded the immediate attention of every elder in the pavilion. The azure mark of Silas's claim pulsed faintly at the collar line of her dress, a glaring, undeniable symbol of her new status. David felt a sickening lurch in his stomach, a chaotic mixture of intense awe and violent, consuming jealousy. Silas gently placed his hand on the small of Luna's back, guiding her up the stone steps with a protective reverence that made David's claws involuntarily elongate against his palms. "Alpha Silas," the chief elder greeted, his voice echoing in the tense air. "And Luna, we are gathered to formally recognize the new alliances of this cycle." A rather hasty gathering. Alpha Vance rumbled from across the pavilion, stepping forward with a condescending sneer. though I suppose some packs must scramble to pick up the discarded scraps of their betters to maintain relevance. A dangerous, low growl vibrated from the chests of the Blood Moon guards. But Silas simply raised a single finger, silencing them instantly. His expression remained incredibly polite, but his dark eyes locked onto Vance with the intensity of a predator viewing prey. Before Silas could speak, Elena released David's arm and took a deliberate step forward, her eyes scanning Luna with mocking pity. It is a pity, truly. Silver Pines requires warriors, not fragile gardeners who wilt under pressure. But I suppose the Blood Moon Pack's standards have fallen if they are willing to accept a known liability as their reigning female. The pavilion held its collective breath. David opened his mouth to intervene, an instinct to protect Luna surging to the surface. But he was paralyzed. He was allied to Elena now. To defend Luna was to break his own treaty. Luna did not shrink back. She did not look to Silas for protection. Instead, she stepped forward, smoothly closing the distance, until she stood only a few feet from the formidable, ironclad heiress. Luna's expression was an exquisite portrait of serene, terrifying calm. A liability, Luna repeated, her voice musical, polite, and carrying effortlessly across the wind-swept stone. A fascinating perspective, Lady Elena. Tell me, when your father's soldiers contracted the marrow-rot fever during the southern campaigns 3 years ago, who do you believe formulated the cure that saved half your standing army? Elena's arrogant smirk faltered, her winter sky eyes narrowing in sudden confusion. That was a humanitarian shipment from the Central Apothecaries. No, Luna corrected softly, a devastatingly polite smile gracing her lips. That was me, working for 3 days without sleep, extracting the marrow root from my fragile gardens. Luna tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing through Elena's hardened exterior. A warrior knows how to take a life, Elena, but a true leader knows how to preserve it. If you believe brutality is your only strength, you will find your reign over Silver Pines to be exceedingly short and incredibly lonely. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena stood frozen, utterly outmaneuvered by the calm, irrefutable grace of the woman she had tried to humiliate. Silas's chest swelled as he looked at Luna, a raw, undeniable look of pride and profound adoration flashing across his battle-scarred face. He stepped beside her, taking her hand and bringing her knuckles to his lips in front of the entire assembly. David felt as though the stone floor had crumbled beneath his feet. He stared at Luna, the brilliant, fiercely intelligent, unyielding woman standing in the center of the pavilion. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, shattering his carefully constructed logic into a million irreparable pieces. She had never been a shadow. She had been the sun, and in his blind ambition, he had forced her behind a cloud. He had not excised a weakness. He had thrown away his crown and handed it directly to a king who finally knew how to worship it. The journey back to the Silver Pines estate from the neutral grounds was suffocatingly quiet. Inside the heavy transport vehicle, the air was thick with unspoken fury and the sharp, metallic tang of Elena's agitated scent. David sat rigidly, staring blankly at the passing tree line. His mind was trapped in an agonizing loop, replaying the exact moment Silas had pressed his lips to Luna's knuckles. He could still see the profound, breathtaking grace she had radiated, a grace he had desperately tried to extinguish. "She is a parlor trick," Elena snapped, finally breaking the heavy silence. Her voice was sharp, a brittle weapon attempting to regain control. A delicate flower playing dress-up in a warlord's court. Silas uses her for optics, nothing more. Do not let her theatrics distract you from our true objective, David. David slowly turned his head to look at his new ally. For the first time, the imposing ironclad heiress did not look like a hardened warrior. She looked like a deeply insecure tyrant. She humiliated you, Elena, David said, his voice terrifyingly calm, devoid of its usual diplomatic warmth. She did it without raising her voice, without drawing a blade, and without a single threat. She merely spoke the truth. That is not a parlor trick. That is power. Elena's pale eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine, venomous anger twisting her aristocratic features. Watch your tone, Alpha. You need my father's soldiers. Your borders are weak. Your people are soft. If you wish to pine after a discarded healer, do so in private. But in public, you will remember who stands beside you now. They did not speak for the remainder of the drive. When they arrived at the estate, the atmosphere was chaotic. The pack members were gathered in the main courtyard, their faces etched with deep, mounting anxiety. As David stepped out of the vehicle, Beta Marcus hurried forward, his expression grim. Alpha, Marcus began, his voice lowered but trembling with urgency. We have a situation. 3 of the border patrols returned an hour ago. They are burning with the marrow rot fever. It seems they contracted it while clearing the damp western ridges for the new ironclad barracks. David felt the blood drain from his face. The marrow rot was a vicious, fast-acting bacterial infection common in the deep woods. Take them to the infirmary, David ordered immediately, his boots echoing sharply against the cobblestones as he strode toward the medical wing. Fetch the marrow root extract. Marcus swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the ground. Sir, we have no extract. The reserves were depleted during the winter, and... He hesitated, glancing nervously at Elena, who had just stepped out of the transport. The Western Botanical Gardens were leveled yesterday afternoon. The ironclad vanguard brought in the excavators to pour the concrete foundations. The roots are destroyed. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. David stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at Marcus, the horrific realization crashing over him like a physical avalanche. Luna's gardens, the sanctuary he had callously ordered destroyed to make room for soldiers. He had paved over the very medicine his people desperately needed. Elena stepped up beside him, crossing her arms over her chest with casual indifference. Quarantine the infected patrols in the outer sheds, she commanded Marcus, completely bypassing David's authority. We cannot risk the fever spreading to the healthy soldiers. If they survive the night, they are strong enough to remain in the pack. If not, it is a natural culling of the weak. A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the gathered Silver Pines wolves. They looked at David, their golden eyes silently begging their alpha to intervene, to protect them from this monstrous pragmatism. David looked at the terrified faces of his people, then at the cold, unyielding profile of the woman he had traded his soul for. He felt a sudden, violent snap inside his chest. The final breaking point of his ambition. No, David said, the word vibrating with a low, dangerous growl that made the courtyard gravel tremble. He turned to Elena, his eyes flashing a brilliant, predatory gold. You will not quarantine my men in sheds. You will not speak of culling my pack. This is Silver Pines, Elena, not a slaughterhouse. Elena stiffened, her hand dropping instinctively to the hilt of the ceremonial blade at her hip. You are bordering on treason against our treaty, David. My father, your father can take his concrete and his arrogance back to the mountains. David interrupted, his voice rising, echoing against the stone walls of the estate. The sheer, oppressive weight of his alpha aura slammed into the courtyard, forcing the ironclad guards to stagger backward. I am the Alpha here. Marcus, take the sick to my personal quarters. Use the ice baths to manage the fever. I will find a cure." As Marcus rushed to obey, David stared down the ironclad heiress. He had made a catastrophic error. But as he watched Elena's smug superiority curdle into rage, he realized he would rather die trying to fix his mistake than live a single day longer in the suffocating armor of a tyrant. He had to save his people, and he knew exactly who held the only cure. By nightfall, the situation at Silver Pines had deteriorated into a waking nightmare. The fever had spread rapidly, claiming 2 more guards and, terrifyingly, Elder Thorn. The grand estate, once a beacon of pristine strength, echoed with the agonizing, ragged coughs of the afflicted. In his expansive master suite, David moved frantically between the beds he had hastily assembled, plunging clothes into freezing water, his expensive formal wear discarded and ruined. He was exhausted, his hands trembling. But the phantom ache in his chest, the void where his bond to Luna used to be, screamed louder than his fatigue. Down in the main hall, a different kind of fever was brewing. Alpha Vance had arrived ahead of schedule, marching through the front doors with a heavy contingent of armed elite guards. Word of David's defiance in the courtyard had reached the ironclad warlord, and he had come to violently assert his dominance. David descended the grand staircase, his sleeves rolled up, his hands stained with cold water and desperation. He met Vance in the center of the hall. The ironclad Alpha looked like a walking mountain of fury, his scarred face twisted into a snarl. Elena standing smugly at his side. "You have forgotten your place, boy," Vance boomed, his voice devoid of any diplomatic pretense. He did not care who heard him. "You begged for my protection. You severed your own mate to prove you had the stomach for our ranks. And now you embarrass my daughter over a few sick whelps?" "They are my pack," David replied, his voice raspy but resolute. The grand hall was lined with his own guards, their hands gripping their weapons tightly, waiting for his command. "Your presence here has brought nothing but destruction. You cleared our medicine. You insult our elders. You demand obedience through fear. I will not let you turn Silver Pines into a graveyard." Vance laughed, a harsh, grating sound that held no humor. "You are already a graveyard, David. You just lack the sense to lie down. You have no allies. You have no healer. By tomorrow morning, half your guard will be dead from the rot. Yield command of the estate to Elena immediately, or I will consider your defiance an act of war, and we will take it by force." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The ironclad forces outnumbered the Silver Pines warriors 2-1, especially with the fever ravaging their ranks. A war would mean total annihilation. David looked around the hall, seeing the profound fear in his people's eyes. He had led them to the edge of a cliff, blindfolded by his own ego. "No," David said softly. The single syllable carried immense weight. He stepped forward, closing the distance until he was chest to chest with the massive warlord. "I yield nothing to you. The treaty is broken. Take your soldiers and leave my lands, Vance. If you draw a blade here tonight, I swear by the ancestors, I will ensure you do not walk out of this valley alive." For a tense, agonizing moment, Vance weighed the threat. He saw the manic, desperate light in David's eyes, the look of a man who had already lost everything that mattered and was entirely prepared to die, taking his enemies with him. Vance sneered, stepping back. "You are a fool," Vance spat, signaling his guards. "You have signed your pack's death warrant. When the fever takes the rest of your strength, we will return, and we will not ask for your surrender then." As the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind the retreating ironclad forces, the grand hall fell into a stunned, terrifying silence. Marcus approached David, his face pale and drawn. "Alpha. They will be back by the end of the week. And Elder Thorn, his breathing is shallow. We cannot stop the fever." David looked at his trembling hands. The crushing weight of his colossal failure pressed him down until he felt he could barely stand. He had prioritized a sword over a shield, and now his people were bleeding out. "Prepare a transport," David whispered, his voice cracking with profound exhaustion and sudden, terrifying clarity. "To where, sir?" Marcus asked, confusion etching his features. "We have nowhere to run." "I am not running, Marcus," David replied, looking toward the large windows that faced the dark, looming mountains to the north. "I am going to the Blood Moon border. Alone." Marcus gasped. "Sir, Silas will kill you on sight. You broke the peace at the neutral grounds. You insulted his Luna. It is suicide." "Perhaps," David agreed, a strange, tragic peace settling over his chaotic mind. "But it is the only chance you have. Keep the ice baths cold. I will bring back a cure, or I will not return at all." He turned and walked out into the freezing night. He was no longer the proud, untouchable Alpha of Silver Pines. He was a broken man, walking into the lion's den to beg the sun for a single ray of light. Thank you for listening to the story. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more movie stories. Let us know in the comments below. Do you think David deserved his fate? Or should Silas have been more lenient with him?